Hello, everybody. Welcome. It is noon exactly, letting everybody enter in, get comfortable. My name is Justin Rivers. I am Chief Experience Officer with Untapped New York. If you have not met me before, usually the one manning these talks and events, and always happy to have you here with us today. Before I get into all of the regular pre-flight speech, Livestorm has had some technical issues this morning, system network-wide. If you're having trouble with audio or visual, again, try to refresh, but sometimes you have to literally come back into your browser. It's been a little slow, but we're going to hope that we change the tide for them. Happy to have you here today. This is a great event. We are celebrating Carole King's 50th anniversary of the release of Tapestry, which happened this February. And we are here with Loren Glass, who is publishing a book, which is coming out tomorrow, about Carole King's Tapestry. We have a link for you to buy the book at 35% off from Bloomsbury's direct website. It is in the chat. And I will post it again at the end of the talk as well. Again, as always, for those of you who are regular attendees, you know this, but for everybody who's new, please feel free to chat and comment at the chat sidebar on the right side of the screen. But please, if you have a question for Loren, put it in the questions tab. I will be monitoring that, and we will do questions and answers after Loren is done with his presentation. If you're having, again, any audio or visual issues, just please refresh. For those of you who bought a ticket to be here, thank you for coming. Thank you for being here today. Our insider membership attendees are here for $10 a month. They get access to all of these talks and all of our archival videos, which are now 100 plus on demand. So feel free to consider becoming an insider. I have the link also in the chat. And I know my experienced attendees have already said hello. Klaus, hello. Hi, Richard from South Florida, Hollywood to be specific. Nancy, coming at you from Tuckahoe. You remember when this album came out. So many memories of this album for so many people. Bertram by Cardiff by the Sea. Hi, Robin. Sylvia, hello again. Yes, it's a beautiful day in New York. All of our 5-borough attendees are going to be really happy with the weather. Joe, hi from London. Robin, membership has its privileges. That's true. Leeds, UK. I'm loving all the UK people coming. We have Wales, we have London, we have Leeds. That's awesome. Former New Yorker, now in Vegas. Howie from Jersey. Robin's first concert was Carole King and James Taylor at MSG. Wow, how amazing is that? My first concert ever as a 12-year-old was at the New Jersey Performing Arts Center, and it was James Taylor. And it was great. And he did You've Got a Friend, of course, and always spoke highly of Carole. So what I'm going to do is I am going to disappear. I'm going to turn it over to Loren, who has a great presentation. We're going to do some listening today. Loren's going to talk about his book, about some of Carole King's experiences in New York, and how that becomes a little bit of fodder for Tapestry and Tapestry itself. So Loren, I'm going to let you go for it. Let me drop the intro slide and say hello.
Thank you so much, Justin, and thank all of you for coming. I can't see you, but I can feel your presence. You've got a portal here right into my basement where I've basically been living for the past year, and this is where labor and leisure has converged around this album and really around this era. So I'm going to start by plunging you into my past. The introduction to my book is called The Mother of Us All, and then I'm going to take you selectively through a few of the chapters, focusing, as Justin indicated, for a good period of time on Carole King's early years in New York. So here we go. One of my earliest memories is of my mother's consciousness-raising group, She Who, chanting in a circle in the living room as I lay alone in bed. She who plays with words, the women would intone in unison. The syntactical ambiguity of the haunting refrain, she who, echoes in my memory against the voices of the singer-songwriters whose albums my mother played as I was growing up. They formed a kind of serial ersatz lullaby, and I've got them around me right here. Joni Mitchell, Laura Nyro, Holly Near, Phoebe Snow, Aretha Franklin, Roberta Flack, Nina Simone, and of course, Carole King. I still have my mother's ring-worn copy of Tapestry. I'm still comforted by You've Got a Friend. I still tear up to the chorus of It's Too Late. My mother left my father and joined the women's liberation movement in 1970. I was 6 and my sister was 4. Like Carole King and her children, we had just moved to California from New York City, and from that point on, my sister and I were counterculturally co-parented. Mom came out as a lesbian, and her lovers became a series of maternal figures modeling alternatives to the patriarchal nuclear families in which they had been raised. She Who, as I was to learn much later, was in fact a set of poems composed to be read aloud communally and collectively by lesbian feminist activist Judy Grahn, a founding member of the Gay Women's Liberation Group, the Women's Press Collective, and a Woman's Place bookstore located at the intersection of College and Broadway in North Oakland, not far from my house. Dad rapidly resettled with a free spirit from Florida, who at the time was living in a Berkeley commune called Home Place. I remember him telling me that of the 3 women he was sleeping with at the time, she was the only one who knew there was going to be a revolution. That was apparently reason enough, as they would move together and have 3 more children in rapid succession. They married much later. Divorce in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1970s was the norm. Most of our parents were separated or divorced, and we all shared in the disorders and discoveries that accompanied their attempts to negotiate the new domestic landscape. It was a time when my 5th grade teacher could sleep with my best friend's mother and take me and my sister to see an afternoon screening of the X-rated film Flesh Gordon, not on the same day. Our parents knew they didn't want to raise us as they had been raised, but they had few models upon which to base alternatives. For my mother in particular, it was crucial that my sister and I be brought up aware of the sexism and stereotypes that had shaped her own childhood and adolescence as the child of Holocaust survivors in Modesto, California. The goal was to raise a self-confident girl who wouldn't be fucked over and a sensitive boy who wouldn't fuck anybody over. Like Laurel Canyon to the south, the Bay Area was a countercultural cauldron of social and sexual experimentation. The 1960s had officially ended at Altamont. My parents had attended but left before the Stones came on because the vibe was so bad. And as the wave of utopian radicalism receded into the recent memory, the activists who had survived settled down, had children, and tried to put at least some of their principles into practice. Civil rights and Black power had transformed the nomenclature of our geography. Grove Street was renamed Martin Luther King Jr. Way, and my elementary school was renamed Malcolm X. Sex education, called social living, began in 6th grade and continued every other year up through graduation. The first book we used, Show Me, a picture book of sex for children and parents, has since been banned internationally as child pornography. All my social living teachers were young, hip women, entirely comfortable talking to teenagers with candor, sensitivity about sex, including contraception, masturbation, and homosexuality. They reminded me of my mother and stepmother. And Tapestry was in heavy rotation. It was in the air, both AM and FM, and on turntables all over the Bay Area. It pervaded both public and private space. Everyone heard it and sang it and bought it. And unlike prior generations, we children of the counterculture shared our parents' musical tastes. In the car and in the living room, we listened and sang along together. In the 1950s and 60s, rock and roll had divided the generations. Indeed, it was one of the main markers of the generation gap. In the 1970s, rock, as it was now called, was more likely to unite them. We all listened to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones, to the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane, and of course, to Carole King. Tapestry opens with the piano, Carole King's native instrument. It is the instrument of composition, the instrument for people who can read and write music. It is also a traditional American status symbol, as the ability to afford and architecturally accommodate an upright piano signifies that your family has made it to the middle class. Not surprisingly, it was the first piece of furniture in Sidney and Eugenia Klein's semi-detached 2-family home in Brooklyn. It was on this old upright that 4-year-old Carole Klein received her first lessons from her mother, Jeannie. Later on, a studio upright would be the instrument on which the newly married Carole King composed hit songs with her new husband, Jerry Goffin, in the cramped cubicles of Aldon Music on 1650 Broadway in Manhattan. For Tapestry, King played a Steinway Grand, and spurred partly by the album's explosion into the national spotlight in 1971, the stately Steinway would become a resonant symbol of the female singer-songwriter, in contrast to the more masculine guitar of folk rock icons such as Bob Dylan. The image of Carole King sitting and singing behind a massive grand piano with a halo of hair still stands as a synecdoche for the 1970s singer-songwriter sound. Get it in a second. For me, the aggressive minor seventh chord that opens "I Feel the Earth Move" introduced an earthquake. We were in California after all, and rumor has it that there was in fact an earthquake on King's birthday in the year of Tapestry's release. But now I realize that the song is really about sex, about female desire, and indeed about female orgasm, which has been represented by earthquakes at least since Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls, and by thunderstorms at least since Kate Chopin's The Storm. As Ann Powers eloquently affirms, the song is a gospel shout out to the feminist cause of orgasms for all. And as Judy Kudelis notes, the rhythm mimics an orgasm, building to a climax and then slowing down languidly. The chords and melody complement this rise and fall as the relative minor of the opening chorus modulates into the dominant major seventh chords of the verse until, after the third and concluding iteration of the chorus, the sky comes tumbling down over and into a descending progression of minor and major sevenths that bears King's inimitable musical signature. Carole King is the queen of chords. Her brilliant progressions are the rich soil bed in which her elegant melodies grow. And this canonical intro confirms a clear compositional authority as the piano pounds alone for two measures before Charlie Larky booms in with his octave bouncing bass line. The seamless accompaniment is fitting, as Larky was King's second husband. The two had been married on September 16, 1970 in a traditional Jewish wedding, and therefore presumably the one making the earth move, biographically speaking. Once Danny Korchmar's guitar starts in to fill in around the vocals in the second chorus, one can sense the comfort level of the entire ensemble, which had been rehearsing in King's Laurel Canyon living room on Wonderland Avenue. It is the sound of Carole King, but also the sound of California, which, unlike New York City, featured large houses with spacious living rooms where musicians could jam as loud as they wanted, whenever they wanted, and for as long as they wanted. A new experience for King, who was accustomed to cramped rehearsal rooms, production deadlines, and suburban subdivisions. But collective as the rehearsals were, the division of musical labor on the album is clear throughout, as Larky, Cooch, and the other accompanists subtly and surely subordinate themselves to the piano and voice. And the voice asserts itself effortlessly. It is not an exceptional singing voice, but this is precisely what gives it a specifically sexual strength in this opening song and throughout the album. As countless listeners have testified, Carole King's singing voice sounds intimate and familiar. Relatively thin in timbre and limited in range, it nevertheless communicates a unique combination of passion and professionalism in service to the song, whose lyrics are in turn always understandable and relatable. It is a voice that invites singing along, a voice that gets in your head and never leaves. It is also a gracious voice, one that has gladly ceded its place to the innumerable other voices who have covered King's songs and made them their own. It is the voice of a friend. And You've Got a Friend, which opens side 2, is a true musical masterpiece. Inextricably linked to, though not directly inspired by James Taylor, who made it a mega hit in the same year, the song epitomizes the relational force field of the entire album, which invites us in and then, in turn, insinuates itself into the pleasures and pains of our own personal lives. Taylor had been introduced to King by Korchmar, a childhood friend and musical collaborator, at the Night Owl Cafe in Greenwich Village in 1967, at least that's one version of the story. And their lifelong platonic friendship embodies the spirit of the album and indeed of the times, which radically expanded the scope of what it meant to have a relationship. Theirs is a friendship based in and lived through music, a friendship that has persisted across many marriages and moves, both emotional and geographic. Taylor's guitar is mixed way down on this track, and indeed throughout the album, subordinated not only to King's voice and piano, but also to the string ensemble. And in later live performances, some quite legendary, their intuitive musical understanding is audible and awe-inspiring. The magic of this song, which also modulates from a relative minor chord sequence, this time in the opening verse, which elegantly encapsulates the lonely desolation everyone feels at some point in their lives, to a dominant major chord sequence in the famous chorus, which heralds the arrival of the friend on call in all seasons, is that it can represent any relationship on which you can rely, from friend to lover to family member. For me, it is as a mother that King sings, and many of the men who contributed to the album describe her as the earth mother of the studio, providing both cookies and comfort. But the song is about anyone you can count on. We all have or want a friend like this. One friend on whom King knew she could rely was producer Lou Adler, who was crucial to the success of Tapestry. When King arrived in Los Angeles in 1968, Adler was already one of the key architects of the emergent California sound and scene, both north and south, having recently produced San Francisco, Be Sure to Wear Flowers in Your Hair, and California Dreaming, with its aching invocation of LA, both written by the Mamas and the Papas musical mastermind, John Phillips. Adler had met Phillips through Barry McGuire, whose Eve of Destruction had been a huge hit for his label Dunhill Records. The Mamas and the Papas would in turn become Dunhill's star act and cash cow. Can You Believe Your Eyes and Ears was in heavy rotation in both my houses, and the controversial cover photo of the Mamas and Papas in a bathtub next to a toilet constitutes one of my earliest album cover memories, eerily indicating in retrospect the polymorphous perversity of the period. At the time, the plurality of the Mamas and the Papas seemed expansive and liberatory, signifying that family arrangements didn't have to be restricted to the standard nuclear form. My sister and I moved back and forth between two alternative domestic arrangements, a lesbian household in which my mother's partners constituted part of a larger community of radical women in the Bay Area, and an ever-expanding second family, which kept the spirit of the 60s alive with May Day festivals, communal childcare, and back-to-the-land adventures growing cannabis in Humboldt County. We had lots of mothers and fathers, and they were also friends. It was the new social frontier epitomized by the legendary Monterey Pop Festival that Adler co-produced with Phillips, literally bridging Northern and Southern California and launching the careers of Jimi Hendrix and Janis Joplin, and generating industry interest in the entire West Coast scene. Adler had been a hustler in the music industry from a young age, joining up with his friend Herb Alpert in the early 1960s to form Herb B. Lou Productions. The two co-wrote What's a Wonderful World with Sam Cooke, with whom Adler would work closely and live briefly until his tragic and untimely death. He met King in the early 60s through her first employers, Don Kirshner and Al Nevins, when he went to New York in search of songs and returned to LA as Alden's West Coast headquarters. Manager of their headquarters. One of the first things King did upon arriving on the West Coast was to look him up. Adler had recently sold his shares in Dunhill Records in order to start Ode as his personal label, allowing him to work more closely and exclusively on albums with artists of his choice. A quiet man with a calm authority in the studio and a cool confidence in public, Adler had a shrewd eye for talent and was committed to King. His job, as he saw it, was to realize her vision, and he knew she had a vision with this album. He famously predicted that it would be the love story of LPs. He also protected her privacy. When King told him that she didn't want to do any publicity, he conducted his own informal set of interviews with her and sent the results out in response to the slew of requests from reporters that followed upon the album's smash success. Ode was one of a number of companies making use of AMM recording facilities housed on the second story of Charlie Chaplin's old Hollywood studio lot on 1416 North La Brea Avenue in 1971. Joni Mitchell, who is making Blue for Reprise in Studio C, and the Carpenters were recording their eponymous album in Studio A. James Taylor, who was dating Mitchell at the time, was recording Mudslide Slim and the Blue Horizon, which would include his version of You've Got a Friend, with producer and manager Peter Asher at Crystal Sound a few blocks away. The cross-fertilization between projects and personnel was generous and generative, and the collaborative atmosphere is illustrated by the many names that recur across the album credits. Indeed, singular as it is, Tapestry was also the product of a Laurel Canyon community whose creative apotheosis it would come to epitomize. In addition to Taylor and Mitchell, David Crosby, Stephen Stills, and Neil Young and Graham Nash would produce, collaboratively and separately, Deja Vu, If I Could Only Remember My Name, Stephen Stills, Songs for Beginners, After the Gold Rush, and Harvest. As with King and Taylor, CSNY was a collaborative, a somewhat more fractious singer-songwriter collective, touring together and playing on each other's albums as an expression of a larger cultural scene. The liner notes on these albums are a veritable who's who of Laurel Canyon, which was becoming the epicenter of a popular music industry that would soon explode into mainstream hegemony with the chart-shattering albums and blockbuster world tours by artists such as the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac in the mid-70s. Tapestry was released on February 10th, 1971. 50 years ago. Its iconic gatefold cover with Jim McCrary's classic photo of the calmly confident and casually barefoot singer-songwriter comfortably seated with her tapestry in her lap and her cat Telemachus on a pillow in the window seat of her Laurel Canyon home provides a perfect visual and verbal complement to the songs whose lyrics are featured on the back. In a practice only recently inaugurated by Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band and then made de rigueur by the singer-songwriters of the 1970s. Countless fans of all genders and ages and ethnicities have read these lyrics as they listen to this album, etching them into our collective memory. Inside the gatefold is a photo of the tapestry itself, subtly signed with a curling C-shaped length of yarn and featuring a small country house and side building surrounded by trees and animals, a bucolic fantasy King would later rustically realize in the mountains of Idaho. If you look carefully, you can see the words "thank you" unobtrusively stitched into the bottom right-hand corner. They are addressed to Adler, to whom King gave the tapestry as a token of her appreciation. It is flanked by photos of King and her musical collaborators, bassist Charlie Larkey, guitarist Danny Cooch Korchmar, drummers Russ Kunkel and Joel O'Brien, backup singers James Taylor and Joni Mitchell, engineer Hank Sicolo, and producer Lou Adler. The inner sleeve is ostentatiously dominated by an enlarged image of Adler's Ode Records trademark, an enormous O spiraling into a smaller D, which in turn encircles a lowercase e. The trademark is designed to look like a spindle adapter, felicitously signifying King's career move from singles in the 1960s to albums in the 1970s. And we're now going to go back to the 1960s. I'm going to shift ahead to my next chapter, which is called Maturity. And this chapter covers Carole King's own youth in New York and her marriage to Goffin. Tapestry was a declaration of independence for Carole King, marking the culmination of her break from the lucrative and already legendary collaboration she had with her ex-husband, Jerry Goffin, and the Brill Building assembly line songwriting system within which they worked in the early 1960s. But the album also includes two songs which were products of that collaboration, Will You Love Me Tomorrow and You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman, leading the listener back to her earlier career as one half of a successful singer-songwriting team for Al Nevins and Don Kirshner's Al Don Music, founded in 1958, where alongside legendary tunesmiths Neil Sedaka, Neil Diamond, and Paul Simon, and in friendly rivalry with Barry Mann and Cynthia Weil, King and Goffin wrote a string of hits for other artists, including Don't Bring Me Down, Take Good Care of My Baby, Chains, One Fine Day, The Locomotion, I'm Into Something Good, and Up on the Roof, among many other lesser-known songs that didn't make the charts. All of these songs were singles geared toward AM radio and the lucrative teen market, and became collectively associated with the Brill Building, a few blocks down Broadway from Aldon, the first song publishing company dedicated exclusively to rock and roll. And Carole Klein's youth coincided with the birth of rock and roll. She grew up listening to inaugural hits such as Rocket 88 and Rock Around the Clock on the radio, attending Alan Freed's landmark integrated stage shows at the Brooklyn Paramount, where she saw the likes of Jerry Lee Lewis, Chuck Berry, Fats Domino, and Little Richard, and watching Elvis Presley's first performance on The Ed Sullivan Show on her family's black and white TV. Her discovery of rock and roll, she claims in her autobiography, coincided with her increasing awareness of the lower half of her body, and that primal connection between puberty and backbeat would inform many of her hits with Goffin. But she had other early musical influences. Her mother began taking her to Broadway musicals in Manhattan when she was 5, after which they would listen to original cast recordings on a portable record player, giving the future composer an early idea of how an album might cohere as a thematically linked series of songs that tell a story. Full cast recordings of shows such as Carousel, Oklahoma, and South Pacific were in essence early iterations of the concept album that would be so central to the rise of rock music as an art form, and lucrative collaborations between industry professionals such as Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein illustrated the ways in which composers and lyricists could not only write hit songs, but also create best-selling albums. She took piano lessons at an early age, but like her mother before her, she didn't like them. Instead, she learned mostly by ear, copying songs from the radio and playing along with records. Gifted with relative pitch, she was a fast learner and encouraged by both her parents. The household was not a happy one. Her parents, Sid and Jeannie, fought often, and the friction between them was exacerbated by having to care for Carole's severely disabled little brother, Richard, who was institutionalized at a young age. Carole was close to both parents, but they were growing apart from each other. They separated when she was 11 and eventually divorced, though her father stayed close to the family throughout Carole's adolescence, and the two eventually remarried. As an adult, King has attributed the conciliatory and comforting tenor of her lyrics to her peacemaking role as a daughter and her desire, common among children of divorce, for a stable domestic environment, a home. It is a desire almost inevitably frustrated by the tendency to repeat the divisions and discord that originally provoked it, as King's 4 marriages and divorces attest. Whatever the tensions, her parents were supportive of her ambitions, and she was ambitious. Carole Klein had already changed her name to Carole King, shrewdly replacing the ethnic with the aristocratic and establishing the premise for many gender-bending headlines, formed a doo-wop band, conducted an orchestra, recorded 2 songs for ABC Paramount when she entered Queens College at the age of 16. There she met and made a few demos with another ambitious young musician named Paul Simon, but they were just friends and never wrote songs together. She wanted a boyfriend and needed a lyricist, and she got both when she met Jerry Goffin, a night student 3 years her senior. At the time, Goffin apparently wanted to write a musical play about the Beat Generation, but in the end he would write, or at least publish, nothing but song lyrics. Other than a slew of obituaries when he died in 2014, very little has been written, published by or about him, except in relation to King. Like her, he was a child of divorce, but if her childhood experiences made her long for a happy and stable family environment, he was clearly more restless and emotionally unstable. Nevertheless, Carole was smitten, and her father, no longer living with her family, but still very much present, strongly disapproved. Goffin frequently spent the night at the Klein household. She quickly became pregnant, and the two were married in a traditional Jewish wedding ceremony in August 1959. She was 17 and he was 20. Initially, he got a job in a chemistry lab, and they worked on songs in the evenings when the baby was asleep. It was Carole's friend, Neil Sedaka, who hooked them up with Don Kirshner, the man with the golden ear. Kirshner had recently pitched the somewhat unlikely idea of a rock and roll publishing company to industry veteran Al Nevins, 20 years his senior, and the fledgling company was always on the lookout for talented young songwriters. King already had both recommendations and bona fides, and Kirshner was quick to accommodate her needs, allowing her to bring her baby, along with a collapsible playpen, to the office and requisitioning the secretaries as babysitters. Goffin continued to work his day job. The division of labor in the popular music industry at the time was strict, with songwriters composing for specific artists assigned by their employers, frequently on tight deadlines in imitation of prior hits. King and Goffin's breakout hit, Will You Love Me Tomorrow, was written overnight and on assignment for Shirley Owens, lead singer for the all-African-American girl group, the Shirelles, as a sideways version of the group's 1960 hit, Tonight's the Night. Owens initially turned it down as too country, meaning too white, but she capitulated after King herself added an arrangement for strings. It was King's first time orchestrating a song. In recording the lyrics, Owens ended up imitating King's vocal style from the Aldon demo, and thus, in King's words, trying to sound like me, sounding like her, a revealing example of how the division of duties in the Brill Building system fostered interracial collaboration, especially between Jewish American composers and African American performers. Indeed, one of the models for King and Goffin's collaboration was Jerry Lieber and Mike Stoller, the legendary Jewish songwriting duo who wrote Hound Dog for Big Mama Thornton. Lieber and Stoller would in turn produce many of their hits for Aldon. Will You Love Me Tomorrow was released on Scepter Records, one of a string of successful labels founded by legendary housewife turned record producer Florence Greenberg, and quickly rocketed to the top of the Billboard Hot 100 in January 1961, a first for an all-female group, black or white. The song is a classic of the girl group era in terms of both sound and sense. Supported by King's orchestrated string arrangement, it anticipates Phil Spector's signature wall of sound, and with lyrics clearly implying premarital sex from the opening line, just after FDA approval of the birth control pill, the song was suggestive without being explicit. It also presaged the unique sexual dynamics of King and Goffin's collaboration, with King composing the music on piano and Goffin writing the lyrics from a female perspective, frequently with King herself as the model and singer on the demo. The song became a standard on 1960s radio with subsequent versions by Brenda Lee, Little Eva, Dusty Springfield, Cher, Jackie DeShannon, The Four Seasons, and Linda Ronstadt. The sheet music also sold briskly, harkening back to the days when the family piano was as much a source of revenue for song publishing companies as AM radio airplay. And the covers continued after King's own haunting reappropriation on Tapestry, with versions by Roberta Flack, Dionne Warwick, Joe Walsh, Brian Ferry, and Amy Winehouse, taking it into the post-feminist era and testifying to its broad appeal across identities and genres. It remains an instantly recognizable hit on oldie stations. At 18, Carole King was little more than a girl herself when the song hit the charts, with Boys by Luther Dixon and Wes Farrell as the B-side. And like the girl groups she wrote for, she had little control over her own career and material. Rather, she worked in a cubicle for a corporation owned and operated by men who called women girls, and she produced music that was associated with adolescent frivolity as opposed to high art. As King herself confirms in her autobiography, "We were chattel. Though paid fairly well, the couple worked on salary and by assignment, with no ownership or control over the songs they wrote. They liked their bosses and their coworkers and appreciated their pay, but they also chafed against the limitations, both cultural and economic. Goffin, in particular, was something of a highbrow whose intellectual pretensions would generate conflict, especially once Bob Dylan came on the scene, directly targeting the commercialism and frivolity of the Brill Building system. King may have been called a girl by most of the men she worked with at Aldon, but by the opening of the decade, she was a grown woman by most measures. By 1962, she had 2 daughters and a full-time job. For the rest of the decade, she would have to juggle family and career while also putting up with Goffin's increasing drug abuse, mental instability, and serial infidelity, as he got swept up in the lively New York City swinging 60s scene. Goffin became particularly erratic over the course of the decade, dropping LSD habitually and with consequent episodes of paranoia and panic, and then, after being diagnosed with schizophrenia, suffering from depression as a side effect of the Thorazine his daughters prescribed in large doses. At one point, King, at the age of 23, had to provide permission for him to receive electroshock therapy. Carole King and Jerry Goffin didn't divorce until 1969, and they continued to enjoy success throughout most of the decade, even as Dylan and the British Invasion merged songwriting and performance, pushing the Brill Building sound and arrangement into the past and permanently transforming the structure of the popular music industry. King couldn't have known it at the time, but she was laying the groundwork for her solo career, not only in terms of honing her songwriting chops, but also, and crucially, in terms of establishing a kind of legacy songbook that she could sprinkle across her solo albums in the 1970s. In addition to the two classics on Tapestry, Up on the Roof closes off side 2 of Writer, the prior album, and Some Kind of Wonderful appears on the 4th track on side 1 of Music, the album which followed Tapestry. These songs, which were also strategically deployed in her performance repertoire, frequently as medleys, carried King's listeners, many of whom didn't know of her prior career as a tunesmith, back to the 1960s of their youth, strengthening their emotional attachment to her albums. Musically speaking, they subtly reminded listeners of King's deep roots in the R&B sound and its interracial origins in the antiquated brill-building system. Don Kirshner's savvy response to the demise of that system was to sell Aldon, along with King and Goffin's contracts, to Screen Gems Columbia Music for $2 million, shifting his focus from New York City to Los Angeles and developing synergies with the film and television industries, which were just beginning to discover the lucrative possibilities of the burgeoning youth counterculture. His most successful foray was surely the Monkees, the ersatz Beatles knockoff band who needed a continuous stream of singles for their surprisingly successful TV show, which ran from 1966 to 1968. King and Goffin wrote a number of songs for the Monkees, including Take a Giant Step, Sweet Young Thing, Sometime in the Morning, Star Collector, and most notably, Pleasant Valley Sunday, which in its pointed satire of suburban status symbol land indicates Goffin's increasing restlessness with the domestic arrangements in West Orange, New Jersey, where the couple had moved in 1965. King longed for the domestic stability promised by the subdivision, but Goffin chafed, continuously tempted by the hedonistic opportunities calling from the big city across the Hudson River. The couple's last collaboration for the Monkees was The Porpoise Song, which opened the band's psychedelic swan song film Head, directed by Bob Rafelson and co-written by a young Jack Nicholson, and one of the inaugural productions of the new Hollywood that would burst into being in the 1970s alongside the Laurel Canyon scene. It also shows the clear influence of Dylan on Goffin's lyrics, opening with, quote, "The clock in the sky is pounding away," and concluding with castles and kings and things that go with a life of style. Increasingly, Goffin's lyrics were invoking both the psychedelic surrealism and ironic cynicism characterized by the new lyrical sensibilities of the album era. The other song on Tapestry from King's past dates to this later period in the couple's collaboration as husband and wife. Written for Aretha Franklin in 1967, You Make Me Feel Like a Natural Woman, in its very title, marks the inception of the political and terminological transition from girl to woman, which would both precipitate and reflect the cresting of feminism's second wave in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The story of its genesis is an industry legend. King and Goffin were walking down Broadway when a huge limousine pulled up alongside them. Producer Jerry Wexler stuck his head out and said he needed a big hit for Aretha, no last name necessary, whom Atlantic had just acquired from Columbia. And he suggested they call it A Natural Woman. The couple, who needed a hit, promptly went home and wrote one. The song features some of Goffin's most memorable turns of phrase, including the metaphorical, "When my soul was in the lost and found, you came along to claim it." It also once again epitomizes the cross-racial and cross-gender lines of identification that were lost with the rise of rock, now newly without the roll, which ironically resegregated the American music industry. King recorded the demo on the very next day and promptly sent it to Wexler, who loved it, as did Aretha herself. Released as a single in 1967, with co-writing credit to Wexler for inspiring the title, the song rose to number 8 on the Billboard Hot 100. In the next year, it was featured as the last track on the first side of Aretha, Lady Soul, which swept the Billboard charts, hitting number 1 as a soul album, number 2 as a pop album, and number 3 as a jazz album, emphatically testifying to Aretha's appeal across genre and race. The song became a performance staple for both Franklin and King, as well as an anthem for a generation of women. Like Will You Love Me Tomorrow, A Natural Woman has been covered repeatedly, including by Peggy Lee, Celine Dion, and Mary J. Blige, as well as being adapted into A Natural Man by George Benson and Rod Stewart. It is entirely appropriate that it close out Tapestry, emphatically affirming King's independent womanhood as a singer-songwriter, as well as her sisterhood with Aretha. Indeed, before King came out with Tapestry, Franklin was arranging full-blown albums that testified to her authority and autonomy as both a woman and a musician. And while the songs on these albums, for the most part, stayed within the conventional terms of heterosexual love, the confident consciousness and compositional authority expressed through them helped to kickstart the women's liberation movement. This trend began with Barbra Streisand, who insisted from the beginning of her contract with Columbia in 1962 that she have total creative control over her albums. Then, across race and genre, trailblazers such as Franklin, Janis Joplin, Loretta Lynn, Nina Simone, and many others over the course of the 1960s began to embody an adult womanhood in stark contrast to the adolescence of the girl groups. In the themes of the songs, in the images and words on the albums, and in their control over their production. These women provided the soundtrack for second wave feminism, inspiring activists and acolytes alike. Many of these artists, including King and Franklin, were also single mothers whose personal struggles for respect in their relations with men mirrored their professional struggles for independence in a male-dominated industry. Their personal lives mapped onto their professional careers, which, in turn, inspired and galvanized the women who bought their records and shared in their struggles. At a time when American men almost across the political spectrum yet casually called women girls or chicks or babes and assumed they occupied a subordinate position in both the family and the workplace, these artists not only sang as and for women, they aggressively injected the word woman into the popular lexicon. Indeed, the peak years of the women's liberation movement coincide with the apogee of the long-playing album as an art form, and this is not an historical coincidence. Unlike the 45 RPM single, which was associated both economically and thematically with teenagers and adolescents, the 33 RPM album was associated with maturity and adulthood by both artists and audiences. Singles were the ephemeral product of AM radio. Albums presented more perennial fare for FM stations and home stereo systems, which were becoming increasingly sophisticated and affordable. If singles were listened to on cheap portable turntables by teenagers in bedrooms of their parents' homes, albums were listened to on expensive stereo systems by adults in their living rooms. And while albums had initially appealed to a mostly male clientele, Tapestry confirmed that there was a large, untapped market of independent women with money and musical sophistication who would, in the 1970s, be a central economic and cultural driver of the singer-songwriter sound. These albums were the soundtrack of the consciousness-raising generation, providing both emotional succor and relationship advice as women reevaluated their personal and professional associations with the men in their lives. As historian Judy Kudelis confirms, the synergy between the women's liberation movement and the popular music industry at this time generated a new market niche, the well-educated, young, single white female consumer primed to make purchases partly predicated on liberation as a concept. The passage from the wistful and anxious, "Will you love me tomorrow?" to the soaring affirmation of "You make me feel like a natural woman" on side 2 of Tapestry encapsulates the passage from girl to woman, both for King personally and for the generation of women to and for whom she wrote and sang. The former is interrogative, virginal, uncertain, crystallizing the tension and anticipation of a first sexual experience without specifying answer or outcome. The latter can be understood to voice that outcome as an ecstatic confirmation of sexual consummation without guilt or regret. The inexperienced interrogative is supplanted by the confident declarative. Adult female sexuality is enacted and affirmed. It is a passage that, for Carole King and her cohort, would be historically indexed by the triumph that is Tapestry. My next chapter is called Trilogy, and it basically analyzes Tapestry in the context of the two albums that came before. I was going to skip that section and then go on to my final chapter, which is called Celebrity. Actually, it's the 4th chapter, and then there's a chapter called Legacy. But actually, I'm going to check in with Justin now to see whether that's a good stopping point to move on to question and answer, since the introduction took up a little more of the time than I thought. What do you think, Justin?
Oh, well, how long will the chapter take, you think? Which way? So you want to go to?
I can add another 5 minutes on Celebrity, if that's.
I think that's totally fine. I think go ahead. Yeah, okay. Let's give us a little more. I've been like so transfixed on your voice. I was like, oh wait, I have to do my job now.
Justin, So what I'm going to do is I'm going to leapfrog the actual discussion, song by song discussion of Tapestry. So you'll have to buy the book to get that.
Yeah, and I just reposted the link as well in the chat. So
wonderful. So this is the penultimate chapter about celebrity. Tapestry made Carole King into an international superstar, but she was a reluctant celebrity, and this reluctance contributed to the nature of her fame. Her insistence on maintaining her privacy ironically resulted in a public image closely associated with the private sphere. Furthermore, the definitions of and boundaries between public and private were undergoing transformation in the 1970s, and the relationship between King's private life and public image reflected these developments for her fans. The sexual revolution had dramatically increased public discussion and display of erotic imagery and intimate experience, while second-wave feminism, the pronouncement that the personal is political, compelled many to consider the degree to which sex and sexuality are suffused with patriarchal power dynamics. At the same time, white middle-class women like King were increasingly entering professional and political spheres, challenging the old boy networks that had heretofore run the world. The result was, for many, a wholesale renegotiation of the relationship between intimate experience and public expression. Tapestry emerged as the soundtrack to these transformative experiences, and it made Carole King a star. Her coronation was nationally announced by Time magazine on July 12, 1971, with a piece entitled "King as Queen?" situating her as first among equals in a group including Carly Simon, Rita Coolidge, and Linda Ronstadt. The profile opens with 2 paragraphs of backstory introducing King as a, quote, young Jewish girl from Brooklyn who pioneered the sound of uptown rhythm and blues in New York City before arriving in Los Angeles and launching her solo career. While many of her fans were unaware of this interracially intertwined backstory, it was well known to music journalists and almost always chronicled and commented upon in their profiles and reviews from this period. The fact that she was a Jewish-American woman from Brooklyn who honed her style writing for and imitating African-American vocalists informed her public image, even for those who were unaware of these crucial details. Changing her name to conceal her ethnic antecedents while adopting African-American musical idioms placed King in an American tradition running back through Al Jolson and the vaudeville stage, simultaneously complicating and confirming her claims to authenticity. The article then emphasizes King's low musical profile. Whoops. Sorry, I lost my place. One more minute here. And both professionally and personally, describing her taking the stage at Carnegie Hall in an unpretentious print dress, looking somewhat frail and plaintive. But this all changes when she sits down to play I Feel the Earth Move, and her profile eloquently registers the transformation that occurs once she begins thumping out the initial piano chords and wailing her opening lines. The author of the article describes her voice as a Canarsie twang with the deceptive thin strength of a whip antenna, the first of many attempts to capture the unique combination of fragility and strength that characterizes both King's singing style and public image. The profile concludes by noting that she lets very little disturb the life she has arranged for herself in the Laurel Canyon house in Los Angeles, where she tends to her 9 and 11-year-old daughters by her first marriage. The article features Tapestry's already ubiquitous cover photo and with the tagline, "Carole King and a Friend at Home in LA." As we have already seen, it was as a friend and a mother that King presented herself on Tapestry, and the press cooperated in creating this syncretic image, which has remained remarkably stable over the course of her long career. Profiles inevitably mention her devotion to her daughters and commonly referred her fans as friends. In a period of fractured families and rising divorce rates, King offered the radical image of a stable domesticity and comfortable camaraderie without a father. Goffin and Larkey are mentioned, but almost never pictured or discussed in any detail in all the public profiles from this period. And King managed to be a rock star without being a sex symbol, an astonishing achievement for either gender in the industry of the time. King sang about sex and sexuality, but her self-presentation had none of the glamour or allure of the classic movie star, nor any of the frantic flamboyance of a figure like Janis Joplin. Her singer-songwriter cohort, or like her singer-songwriter cohort more generally, she sang as the subject, not the object, of sexual experience and desire, nor did she suffer from the journalistic gossip mill like her colleagues Carly Simon and Joni Mitchell, Mitchell. Carole King was celebrated as a woman, not a lady or a girl, and she rarely appeared in gossip columns, though her personal life was turbulent at times. Since she refused to be interviewed, she did no publicity or promotion and only toured selectively. Her public image was shaped by a kind of economy of scarcity in which Jim McCrary's photographic archive loomed large. Tapestry's cover photo rapidly became ubiquitous, supplemented by a series of publicity shots of King in windows in living rooms. Some of these, like Tapestry's cover, are shot from within, and others feature exteriors, framing King looking out at the window as a visual trope. Windows are ambiguous, both inviting us in and keeping us out. It is as if McCrary is enabling us to vicariously occupy the boundary between King's private and public personae, to see her looking out at us from a domestic interior to which we have no real access. And now I'll just read a little bit of concluding about King's final move from California. I have a brief discussions here of the many albums actually that she came out with after Tapestry, none as well known as Tapestry, and none, I guess, honestly as good as Tapestry, but certainly the songwriting is as good. Celebrity has its liabilities as well as its benefits, particularly for women. Most men resist and resent being subordinated, the subordinate power in a monogamous couple, and King's somewhat sordid saga of serial monogamy is sadly a fairly standard narrative arc for female rock stars. However, although she followed her next husband ever, I'm forgetting his first name now, to Idaho, it is important to clarify that there were other considerations driving her decision. For one thing, Los Angeles had become a much less mellow scene, saturated with big money and hard drugs, and King surely worried about her daughters getting seduced into the predatory groupie scene developing just down the road on Sunset Strip. Furthermore, getting back to the land was a generational trend for disaffected ex-hippies in the mid-70s, a reverse migration from city to country in which my own parents participated when my father and stepmother bought into a communally owned 80-acre parcel in southern Humboldt County on which they would build a house in the 1970s. King herself would later represent the move to Idaho as a way to retain some of the utopian aspirations of the 1960s, and her willingness, indeed eagerness, to live in a desolate wilderness testifies to her steely determination. I have one more point to make here, and then we'll open it up for discussion. Sorry about the skipping around here. I just want to make a comment about this last. In her extensive advocacy for liberal and environmental causes, King figures as an exemplar of David Shumway's claim that the rock star emerged in the post-war era as a new form of celebrity with a resolutely political valence. If most movie stars of the classical Hollywood era tended to avoid political controversy with professionally curated public images, rock stars from Elvis onward embraced it, both symbolically in terms of social and sexual freedom they modeled, and at least for some, more directly in terms of endorsing specific politicians and causes. From early on, King worked to leverage her stardom politically, starting with the ill-fated presidential campaign of George McGovern. Then she has thrown her weight behind a series of Democratic presidential candidates since then, including Gary Hart, John Kerry, and Barack Obama. And she has been, of course, a vigorous critic of the Trump administration. I think I'll end there. The last chapter is called Legacy, and I talk about some of the compilations and reissues, and then finally her incredible performance at Hyde Park, which if you haven't seen, you should all go home and watch it right now. Thank you.
Loren, amazing. Thank you. Yeah, and I think we'll leave them wanting more, because I do. Now I have to read the last chapter. But thank you very much. It was noted by Robert Morbo Morbeck that this is obviously a labor of love for you. Thanks for all of your enthusiasm, and that's so true. So actually, that's one of the questions I have for you. If you have questions for Loren, please put them in the questions tab. So Carole King, how and why for you was this so important a topic to tackle? I mean, I know the timing's right, obviously.
It's a combination of my early album memories, and of my mother's single motherhood and being involved in the radical women's movement in the early 70s in the Bay Area. And it gradually developed actually out of my interest in the album form and talks I had given about the album form. And I was fascinated with the sort of convergence of public and private history and the way sort of my private memories read into my larger historical understanding of what albums meant to people at that time. And to tell you the truth, Justin, what would happen is I would always open my talks with this anecdote about listening to Carole King when I was a kid in my mother's house. And afterwards, everyone would just come and ask me about that. And the passion for Tapestry, it was partly, I mean, it was my love for it, but it was partly my response to the love for it that other people had. Just the expressions on their faces, the passion of their questions, and the interest in my combination of autobiography and history. I'm not actually a creative nonfiction writer. I'm mostly a literary critic and literary historian. But the sort of personal satisfaction and the crowd response to those personal memories made me realize how powerful they are, not just for me, but as a connection to other people who were related to this, connected to this album. So, it was originally, it was one of a series of albums that I, talked about and thought about. But then when I realized astonishingly that nobody had written one for the 33 1/3 series, I figured I'd take a chance and propose it, because it seemed like a perfect way to combine, again, my private story with the kind of more, whatever public or academic kind of history of the era. So that's why there's some musings about other issues. And by the way, for those who are curious about my thoughts there, Bloomsbury is going to run a blog series later this month where I expand out a little bit more on other albums and other ideas about the album era as that basically 1965 to 75 period that many of us go back to when we think about our favorite albums.
Oh, cool. Will that be accessible over Bloomsbury's
website? Well, yeah, that'll be on they're basically letting me guest blog for a week.
Oh, nice. Oh, cool.
I don't know what date it's going to be, but it'll be up there.
Oh, great. Well, we'll take a look out for that, because that's awesome. Because, yeah, I mean, one of the things as I was listening to you is, God, that was just such fertile ground for so many artists at the time. That it was, I remember like being born in 78 and coming into a father who really appreciated rock and that era, more on the counterculture side, and a mother who was very traditional. The records couldn't be on two sides of of the spectrum. It was, Barbra Streisand and Judy Garland on this side, and then my dad had, the Doors and everybody going on that side. And again, like we've talked about multiple times, Carole King was, neutral ground. Everybody landed on Tapestry. So we have a couple other comments here. Jack said, he loved how Carole King repurposed it's not too late to get the coronavirus vaccine instead of Martin's reworking of Jolene into vaccine, which is great. That is awesome. I actually forgot about that, Jack. Thank you for bringing that up. That's awesome. Margaret says, please discuss her relationship to herself as a Jew. Interesting question.
That is a fascinating question that I didn't think about. Well, so we know in terms of the traditional cultural, shall we say, formation or pattern of Jews who get into popular music as in a sort of complex collaboration with the African-American scene. That was obviously just a natural development for King as she grew up. I don't know much about her thoughts of herself as a Jew religiously, although I can say that both of her marriages were Jewish marriages, right? So her marriage to Goffin was a traditional Jewish marriage, and her marriage to Charlie Larkey was a traditional Jewish marriage. And I guess I think of her like my parents, both my parents. My father's a New York Jew. My mother grew up in California, but as a kind of agnostic cultural Jew that is, in a funny way, maybe not as common now as they used to be, partly because of how prominent, and here I'm thinking of figures from Philip Roth to Paul Simon, who are clearly recognizably Jews, for those of us Jews who recognize them as such, and I think embrace their Jewishness, but in a kind of secular cultural way. Carole King is very, I guess I would say, spiritual, and very sort of affirmative in her spiritual and religious sensibilities. But in all I've read by or about her, so I have to admit, I'm not even sure her daughters were bat mitzvahed, although I bet they were. But I see her as at least in my projection onto her, I did not interview her, she does not give interviews, as basically a cultural Jew, someone who is so comfortable being a Jew growing up in New York that she just accepted it as an uncontroversial cultural identity, which in a certain way gives you a pathway into cultural production that's almost privileged. Particularly, growing up as a New York Jew, you're going to get into publishing or music or the stage or something, or it's a sort of natural progression. That she, and indeed many of the folks that she worked with in the industry were likewise New York Jews or urban Jews who ended up in the entertainment industry. I'm not sure whether, like feminism as something, her image is a carefully curated maternal image. She hasn't embraced radical feminism, although she certainly is sympathetic with women's liberation. And so to a certain degree, I feel like she's cultivated what you might call a generalist image, a sort of image that makes her maternally available to all of us. But I'm going to have to apologize to the questioner. In all the research I did, besides the comments about her appearance, right, and her voice, the sort of Canarsie, right, the way in which she has mannerisms or even physiognomy that invokes being Jewish. I'm not aware of her ever speaking about it, or of it being a central critical element besides just identifying that standard path that I remarked upon. So that's a fascinating question that I can only answer in that sort of general way.
And it could also be something, this is just inference from the fact that she is an incredibly private person that may remain, her spirituality may remain incredibly private for her as well.
I think
maybe even more so than sexuality, but that's just me throwing that out there. Michael has a really great question for you too. Do you really think that music, rhymes and reasons, or even fantasy are inferior to Tapestry? I feel that those albums are so underrated. Perhaps it's more that Tapestry came out at the right time to make the impact it did. I was wondering if you discuss this in the book.
I do. And actually part of what happened was that Tapestry made such a smash that everything just looked minor in comparison, right? So unfortunately, music is in fact a fantastic album, and it sold almost, it sold very well when it came out. I personally like Writer, the album which came out before it, although it has some production issues. And I would actually say that Carole King's songwriting remains impeccable throughout. The lyrics get more uneven, and her collaborations with folks aren't always, I've felt as satisfying to me. I find fantasy to be a fascinating effort that got undue criticism, I think. So two things happened, and I do write about this in my book. I have a brief discussion of all of the albums up to 1975. And part of what happened is, one is that Tapestry just, it shines so brightly that everything else sort of fell into the background. The other thing had to do, I think, with audience categories in the music industry. She got relegated to adult contemporary, and it sort of it narrowed her field. Tapestry was for everybody. There was no category. I mean, it was just it immediately resonated as of the era in a very broad way, and sort of ushered in this singer-songwriter sound. But over the course of the early 70s, and you have the new kind of arena rock and the Eagles and other kinds of forms emerging and displacing the popularity of the singer-songwriters, I think that King got sort of pigeonholed into this area. And then, of course, she herself withdrew. She didn't want to give publicity, and then she didn't even want to, appear. She really sort of disappeared for a period of time. So the lack of her own promotion, I think, also hurt the sales of those albums. But what I argue in my book is that the songwriting remains impeccable throughout. I mean, Carole King is an exquisite songwriter, but something about the collaboration with Stern and Adler, and the scene and the impetus behind Tapestry, and then the reception of Tapestry, just made it rise above everything else, so that they all just became these distant satellites. So I encourage people to go back and listen to them. They are great albums, but it's even, it's hard not to hear them in reference to Tapestry,
Yeah.
even if, so that's my answer there.
That's great. No, and a good one as well. And more, I'm sure, discussed in the book. One more time, I'm going to put the link at the bottom of the chat so you have it here. If there are no other questions, if there are other questions, put them in now. If not, before I let Loren wrap up, I am going to remind our audience of what's coming up in the programming schedule. So tomorrow, we are doing Made in New York, which is photographer Chris Payne's look inside New York factories. I had a preview of this last week with Chris when we did our tech check. It's going to be amazing. And then Tuesday, and that's at 5 p.m. Tuesday, Secrets of Fort Tryon Park in Hudson Heights. That will be Alan Cohen will be back, who is a native of those parts. He's going to be doing a great virtual tour of that area. Nicole, is that at 5 or at 3? If you could confirm, because I think it's down as 5, but I do remember Alan wanting to do something at 3, but I can't remember which. And I see Nicole is typing, so she will be clarifying that. I think it's 5, but I don't want to confuse everybody. It's at 5. Okay, so 5 o'clock. We're right. We're good. And before we go, Loren, is there anything you would like to say as a wrap-up?
I just want to thank you all for attending, even though I can't see you. This is my first launch of this book. This is my first writing about music. I want to say how wonderful it is to write about music. I guess that's what I want to stop by saying. I have written mostly about literature, and I love literature, but the passion that it brought out in me and in the audiences and people that I shared it with was truly a pleasure. So I hope that you can feel that pleasure if you buy the book, if you read my blog. It's really a wonderful new area I've been able to venture out into, and I thank you all for witnessing my debut, I guess.
Yeah, well, it was an honor to be here, and we will be on the lookout. It launches tomorrow. There is also a Kindle version as well that is out there, but again, you can click on that link and save 35% because you joined us today with Loren, and we thank you all for attending. You're getting great kudos, really fascinating. Well done. Thank you very much. Really interesting. Lorraine says, thank you so much. Fascinating about all the collaborations and friendships in the 60s and 70s. Richard Roth says, wonderful presentation. Thank you. It's so nice. I was texting Nicole. I was like, this is such a nice change of pace. You reading from a book. Usually if I'm doing a talk with the insiders, we usually just, it's me throwing thousands of visuals at everybody really quickly. This was just like nice hanging out, listening to music, hearing your thoughts. So we really enjoyed it. Very much. And all right, well, have a good one. Good luck. And thanks everybody for attending. There will be a recording made available in about 3 or 4 minutes after this is done. And for insiders, it will be in the archives as well. Have a great day, everybody. And as always, stay safe. Bye.